And I'm going to moderate this session on behalf of all the partners that have been contributing to the organization of this session, in particular FAO, but also WRI, IUCN, FAO. We're all in a partnership in working toward this session. The way this is organized, that we are going to have a session today that will focus on the experience of certain countries in relation to food, land use, and landscape restoration. And we are going to look tomorrow as a follow-up to what is the way forward. So the two sessions are going to be connected and nested, and one is going to lead to the other one. I also have some technical announcement. Some of the speakers will speak in Spanish, and so we have the audífonos that you can find in a box just there. If you need them, we are going to have translation in all the languages. So I think that with that, let me start by inviting the Assistant Director General from FAO, Mr. Hiroto Mitsugi, to come and give us some words and opening the session for us. Hiroto, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paula. And also thank you just making the good pronunciations of my family name. It's sometimes very difficult. Okay, and good afternoon, everybody, and also distinguished guests and the participants. So on behalf of FAOs and also their big partners, and here we very much welcome you to this very important series of the two discussion forums, as Paula said. Today and tomorrow, we have the two discussion forums here. So this is only the one which directly address the vital issue of meeting food security needs and improving livelihood and local economies through the landscape restorations and sustainable management as well. So while we are guided by the global framework agreement like the SDGs and Agenda 2030s, everybody know about it. But the real work is going on at the country levels and also local levels, and within the mosaics of farms, forest, and productive landscapes on the ground. So we FAO, also their partners, the World Bank, World Resource Institutions, and the CIFORs and IUCNs. So we are working hard to support these countries' effort and to provide assistance to help them achieve these multiple goals through increasingly integrated and cross-sectoral approaches. So together we felt it was important to begin by hearing directly from those involved and learning from innovative examples. So maybe two sessions here. First one, maybe we can hear today's, and also tomorrow we have way forward. We have discussed about it. So in FAOs, we have a strategic framework which totally aligned to the SDG target and which facilitates our effort to reach across the traditional department silos. And the first department, and also the climate, biodiversity, and the land and water department now is a coordinating effort with many other departments around integrated landscapes, restorations, and management. And within the first department, so we are also trying to increase the integrated approach, our landscape-based work over the major programs. So there's so many programs we had, like RED Plus, and also farm facilities, and the FLEGTs, and also sustainable wildlife management. So now, for this program, every time we just make much focus on that, the so-called integrated approach, taking into account it. So integrated landscape management can contribute to many of the SDGs, and there is tremendous potentials to restore the hundreds of the millions of hectares, and which create a new natural resource asset base for the rural pools. But in order to maximize these contributions, you have to be very explicit in including food securities and the livelihood of indigenous peoples, local communities, smallholders, women and youth who highly depend on and shoulder much of the responsibilities for these territories in large landscapes. So the way countries set policies, integrate across sectors, align tenures, the build producer organizations, and design and implement the technical solutions, it will determine how well they can integrate the approaches. So we as supporting organizations, we must work to integrate our own effort and collaborate more effectively together. So we hope that these sessions and other deliberations will help move the agenda forward practically on the ground and contribute to the large agendas of the global landscape forums. So we have a number of guests of today's, and also I very much appreciate the guest participation, also your audience participation today's. So I hope quite a good interaction among us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Assistant Director General Hiroto Mitsugi. And now let me call to the podium the panelists. So let me start with Telmo Munoz Rodriguez, Director General of Bosque y Tierra in Bolivia. Telmo, if you can just come and sit at the podium. And then let me call also to the podium from Malawi, Clement Chilma from the Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Mining. Thank you, Dr. Chilima. Then let me call Sa Davis from the Forest Development Authority of Liberia. This sit here with us. And then let me call from Italy, Professor Mauro Agnoletti from University of Firenze and from the Landscape Lab of Tuscany region. Okay. So thank you very much to everybody for coming today. Before we start,
I forgot Manuel from Bolivia.
Marcelo.
all together. Oh, sorry. I mean, we have two people from Bolivia with us. We also have Marcelo Gabriel Cardonio Vacaflor. Please come to the podium. Thank you so much, sorry. All right. And before we start with the panelists, I also want to remind to everybody to please get ready because we have a lot of questions, because we want to have a lot of questions and answers towards the end once the panelists have spoken. So, dear panelists, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that this topic of landscape approaches for food security and resilient livelihoods is a topic that is really important and is coming up all the time. We are not talking about landscape approaches for the beauty on conserving the landscape. We are really talking because it's important for linking it to food security and linking to the livelihood of the people. So with that background, we would like to hear from all these countries how in your countries you are trying to find solution to these issues, and you're using the landscape approach for this kind of solving these very important issues, and what are the challenges that you face, and what are some of the lessons learned that are coming out of your experience in your country. So let me start with Bolivia, with Telmo, the Director General. If you can give us a little bit of a description of the programs that you are having in Bolivia. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to say the Control of Forestry Authority in Bolivia has developed a new vision in the management of forestries in our country. How long do I have for speaking? 7 minutes, 7 minutes, about 7 minutes. Perfect, so I could talk a little bit faster then. Well, as I was saying, we have a new vision in forestry management in Bolivia because there was an old law from 1997 and we had a different model of sustainable development of forestry according to concession, for example. And we have a change in that system because there is a big loss of surface covered by forests. We have about 5 to 7 million hectares in forest. And now we have developed a new way to giving land to other actors. In Bolivia, about 70% of the land is in the hands of farmers' communities, of indigenous communities. That means that we have experienced a completely radical change in the use of land and forest in Bolivia. Nevertheless, that change has also caused a change in the management of the natural resources because in former time, it was the entrepreneurs, it was the companies that managed the land and they used forests. But now we see a different situation since there are smallholders who own those lands. The companies, they don't have any possibility to manage those lands. So those communities don't have the technology, for example, to work on that land. And many forests were given to indigenous and small farmer communities, and that's the reason why we have to develop a new model in this situation. We have started with this new model about 5 years ago, and that's what I want to talk about today. The new model we had developed in our model of management for forestry and land in Bolivia by farmers and indigenous communities. We started 2 or 3 years ago with this new model, and now we have about 1 million of hectares that were given to those small farmers and indigenous communities. We have an integral model of management. That means that the communities, they have the different tools in planning and management of the land and forest. Nevertheless, they don't have the knowledge, they have the know-how to have a proper management, and they don't have the capacities and they don't have the money to develop a real model in order to have a real use and effective use of the land. And they don't have an access to market. So we have developed a new vision of the forest. The forest is not only lumber, it's not only timber, but we have a forest as a landscape and people living in the forest, and that's the most important thing, the social aspect of forest, because forests offer livelihood to the people. So we have a participatory approach in the development of that kind of instruments. That means that the communities and the people, they develop ownership of those instruments, of those systems, and then they understand really what it means to be the real manager of their own territories. In Bolivia, we can say there are communities that own about 200 hectares, up to 15,000, 20,000 hectares. It depends on the region of the country. So it is important to have a new model to allow a new access to this kind of model. So we have to be very effective in the management of the natural resources in the forest. So it is important for Bolivian to have a real support, but a real project. We need support, technical support, for example, and financial support in order to develop that kind of model. I think it is important to have that, and it's important for supporting that kind of communities. We're talking about 70% of the territory of Bolivia in the hands of those communities. The agro-industrial companies, they only own about 16% of the land in the country, and that's the place where the main producers of food are located in Bolivia. Which are the biggest constraints we have to face in the last 3 or 5 years? First of all, the fact that we cannot see a new vision in the managers at local level. For example, the local governments, the regional governments, they think that the infrastructure projects are more important, that kind of land use, for example. They concentrated the focus more in health services, for example, which I think is very important, but they don't work so much in agricultural production. So it is important to offer new answers to develop a new model. Otherwise, we would be at the brink of a crisis in Bolivia. So many communities that own a lot of land, they won't be able to develop a real model in order to manage their land. So it's important to support those communities because they don't have technology. They don't have the money to apply all those instruments and all those tools we can offer to them. And they don't know how to do it. It's important to manage the resources, to transform the resources, to look for the market, access to the markets, and then find a business case for those. So please help us. Please support our model because it's important that we talk about the new possibilities, and it is important to learn a lot from you. My main message in this event would be that we need to receive support. It is important that projects at global level are developed, not only in Bolivia, but in many other countries also, that we can develop that kind of systems at international level. I have talked to some colleagues that also participate in this event, but I think, and we came to the conclusion that not only Bolivia has this problem, but many other countries, not only Latin America, but all over the world. So it's important that many institutions, governmental institutions, for example, or international institutions, donor organizations should support us in order to have a more effective use of the land in our countries. And I have to say that we are completely convinced that we need training of human resources in order to develop the proper models for management of the land and land use. It is important to have a real technology transfer and knowledge transfer for those communities. And something I would like to say too is that there are already many experiences, many situations, many projects in these territories, about 1 million hectares. Many people are working there. They have been working hardly, trying to find allies in order to receive support, technical and financial support. The best example of this kind of work is my colleague from Bolivia. I am a representative of the government, and I work together with one person that supports the government in developing those models. And I think it is important to have that. It's important that international organizations support all the local organizations in order to develop these new models, these new projects for integral management of land and forestries in Bolivia. Thank you very much.
Telmo, for explaining to us a bit the changes that happened in Bolivia from sustainable forest management big concession through the land tenure process into a much more sort of community forestry. And we will see that that's a team that is going to be present in other of the countries. But I think it's very interesting to complement your intervention with actually the intervention for Marcelo Cardoso from Minga, who is going to give us some example on how they are bringing these elements of forest and farm working together at the level of the communities. Marcelo.
Okay. Hola.
Good afternoon. I have a microphone already. Thank you very much. My organization, Minga, we are located on the east part of Bolivia, near to the border of Brazil. We were founded about 30 years ago, and we work together with 34 different communities. We cover about 90,000 hectares. The different communities have about 1,500 to 5,000 hectares. And we exploit lumber, we have agroforestry, for example. We also have cattle tenants. In 2016, we started a new project with the support of FAO. We started with 10 different projects for management of land use. About 20,000 hectares, members of Minga, communities members of Minga, they started working under this project. Normally, those plans in the region of Chiquitania, we have 5 main elements. First of all, the management of forests, also cattle, agriculture, livelihood, agroforestry systems. Minga has supported the integral support, the management of forests, and also the livelihood of the people. Basically, what I want to say about Minga is that we, as members, as producers of the communities, we know that those plans are very positive for the communities. It is a real alternative because people are able to use the forest and use land in a much more effective way with a real plan. So sometimes we have some plants and we have some plantation in the forest, and after 2 or 3 years we have to change the place where we have those plantations. So if we are able to identify the real surface that it's appropriate for agriculture and for cattle, for example, then we could have plans on a longer term. And another thing I would like to say to you is that those plans are managed by the community itself. In the region Chiquitana, we are talking about caciques, like this, the chief of the community, and they are responsible of those plans. So it is important to have a good chief that is responsible for the management. So it is important to have a real long-term plan and a support by many institutions or the government in order to have a real sustainable plan in those communities. Those plans support the communities. We, as association, as Minga, we think that it is important that those plans include diversification, that they allow the participation of the communities, because normally communities have 4 or 5 products, but due to climate change, in future it will be impossible to survive out of these 4 or 5 products. So it is important to have a diversification of the production. It's important to have other products. In case one product fails, it is important to have another alternative for production. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Those have been very interesting messages. Thank you very much. We see a new vision here. Those are wonderful examples of what is to have real models that are developed by the community. And the participation of the community is very interesting, very important here.
And they can be an important example for many other countries And because it's the first time I really hear at the level of the communities that you have plans that look at the different elements, the forest, the cattle, the agroforestry, etc. So I'm get ready with questions in really trying to understand how this works, and if I have a lot of questions for you to understand if then the communities are going to sell products coming from there, or is it for subsistence, or how does it really work in order to increase the income of these communities. But now let's move to a different countries. We leave the questions for later. So let's move to Malawi. And here we have Dr. Clement Chilima of the Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Mining. Malawi is one of the countries that has pledged to the Bond Challenge, that is committed to the Africa 100, that has done fantastic work on the restoration opportunities analysis, etc. Would you like to share with us a little bit about the national strategies that you have for natural resource and landscape restoration strategy, and see what have been some successes that you had so far and some challenges?
Thank you very much. Yes, Malawi, we are in the southern part of Africa, and I think some of the things I'll be mentioning are quite common to other countries there. Economy of the country, including food security, livelihoods, are highly hinged on land. Malawi is mostly land-based in terms of economy. And so it became very critical or clear to the government that we need to do something about the degradation of the land. We did an analysis and found that almost 8 million hectares of the country is degraded to different scales. And that analysis was done as part of the strategy, as we are developing the strategy. We carried out a nationwide survey engaging everybody at different levels, not everybody, but representatives of various categories of people, down to the community. At district level, we carried out analysis, listened to them, heard their views about degradation and what they think can be done to restore their pieces of land next door. We did that district by district throughout the country and came up with that figure of 8 million hectares that is degraded to various levels. And based on what the people are already doing, we came up with priorities of what can be scaled out. And we thought to redress or to restore 8 million hectares may be too ambitious. So we came up with a figure of 4.5 million hectares, which is still quite ambitious. It's more than half of the degraded land of the country. 4.5 million hectares was the target that we declared through the Bond Challenge to the African AFR 100, and we are working towards that. We have identified the 4.5 million hectares to be restored by 2030. A strategy was developed through a process of analysis, the ROM analysis throughout the country, and that strategy was launched in June at a high-level meeting where we invited the whole SADC region. The aim was to show the seriousness of the country to restore this 4.5 million hectares, but also to engage other countries around Malawi in the SADC region to encourage them to join the wagon of restoration. Among the priority areas that were identified during the assessment of the country were improved agriculture technologies, community forests and woodlots, forest plantations and protection of forest reserves, soil and water conservation technologies, and river and stream bank restoration. those were priorities, and underneath each priority were specific activities. So there's a whole plan that is in place in the strategy on addressing landscape degradation using these priorities. During the survey, we identified that one of the major problems in the country is charcoal. Charcoal production and sustainable charcoal production is a serious problem. A lot of forests are being cut in the country and surrounding countries too, in order to provide charcoal, which is used for energy at a domestic level. 90% of Malawians use charcoal as a main source of energy for cooking and heating in homes. That's an area that we thought should be seriously addressed. So one of the activities was to develop a strategy specifically for charcoal. So we actually developed another strategy, a charcoal strategy. As I'm talking, there are plans that as soon as we come out of the Christmas holidays, there's a team that will meet to develop the implementation strategy for this strategy, or implementation plan for this strategy. As I mentioned earlier, to finalize, I've only been given 8 minutes, so I try to be as brief as possible. But we called for a SADC meeting in June this year, where we invited all the heads, ministers responsible for landscape, forests, and agriculture. And during that meeting, when we launched the documents that I mentioned, the 2 strategies, but we did encourage other countries in the SADC region. In fact, now a number of them have pledged that they will indicate areas that they also want to restore. We believe that restoring, dealing with problems in Malawi, especially the charcoal and illegal, which I didn't mention, illegal logging that is taking place, is not going to work if we don't address cross-border problems and so forth. So in short, I'll mention those, but if you want me to go through challenges, I can do that.
You can have 1 more minute for the challenge.
One of the challenges, as I mentioned, is charcoal production. We have serious problems of degradation in terms of people looking for additional land to cultivate. Problem being high population density, high levels of poverty, so people rely heavily on natural resources for sustainable for livelihoods. Productivity per unit area has gone down because of overuse of small pieces of land, and also degradation of the landscapes, of the sources of water. So these are the major problems of the country. In terms of implementing this strategy, we also have challenges in terms of how do we engage everybody. Although in the analysis we try to engage as many sectors as possible, but we need support, I think, to develop a strategy where all players, because the strategy is not just forestry. We look at the landscape, which involves agriculture, water conservation, wildlife, and so on, to bring all those together and then monitor the impact of degradation, the impact of what we're doing. That's an area that we believe needs to be seriously looked at, and it's a challenge at the moment. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clement, for giving us a brief outlook of a strategy for landscape restoration in Malawi. And I would like actually to applaud Malawi for committing to 4.5 million hectares of restoration, because that's a challenge. But it shows the commitment of the countries, which is really amazing. And I want also to say that this methodology, the ROM, the Restoration Opportunity Analysis methodology, I think it's a fantastic tool, and I would really suggest to the countries that need to work on restoration to really use it. It's very flexible. It has been developed by IUCN and WRI. We are using it because we are partners. The World Bank is using it in many other countries, and it's really helping a lot to identify where it's worth to restore your land as a first priority. etc. So thank you very much, and we need to see later on a little bit more about the implementation, because these charcoal issues, we just coming from another session where we were talking about how to be forest smart. We need to involve other ministries, and it's also energy ministries that should be sitting at the table to discuss the charcoal issues, for example. But now let me move to another country, Liberia. So here we have Sad Davis. He is the coordinator of a big program, the Red Plus program in Liberia. Liberia has done incredible changes from when the forest was only there for commercial purpose into one of the biggest programs for landscape restoration. Sad, would you like to describe to us a little bit about the phases what happened in Liberia, how this changed, and what is the focus of your program?
Thank you very much, Paula, and we want to say thanks to the organizers of this program. Forgive me for my voice, I'm down with a cold, but we think it's good to come and share our experience with our colleagues. And if you look at the history of forestry in Liberia, it is no strange thing that we are today sitting in Bonn, Germany. The history of forestry in Liberia started with the German forestry mission. In the late 1950s and 60s, there was a German forestry mission that went to Liberia to advise the government of Liberia as to how the government could do sustainable forest management. And so as we progress, forestry in Liberia at that point in time was merely commercial forestry. So all of our forestry activities were centered around commercial forestry. Even though at that time the German forestry mission recommended to the government of Liberia that there were strategic patches of forest in Liberia that needed to be kept either as national forests or as protected areas. So then came the Civil War of Liberia. It was alleged that some of the funding for the civil crisis came from the logging concessions. So there was an imposition of ban by the UN Security Council on the Liberia forestry sector. So in order to lift the ban for Liberia to be able to export timber, raw timber, Liberia had to carry on a vigorous reform. And part of the reform came what we refer to today as the 3 Cs in Liberia. We talk about commercial forestry, conservation, and community forestry. So at the heart of our forestry in Liberia now are the 3 Cs. And hopefully, from where some of us sit, will be emerging a 4th C that has to do with carbon. So what is happening in Liberia now in terms of forestry, livelihood, degradation, restoration, this is where we are. It's a long story, but to cut it short because we are given 7 minutes, this is where we are. We enter into what is called the letter of intent. We signed a letter of intent with Norway in 2014. And that letter of intent that was signed with Norway in 2014 is for Norway to provide the government of Liberia or the people of Liberia with resources, mainly financial resources, to be able to conserve some of our forests. Mind you, in 2005, 2006, when the reform went on in the forestry sector, the people of Liberia and the government of Liberia committed ourselves to conserving at least 30% of our remaining forest estate. And also taking into consideration that the Upper Guinea forests, from Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, coming down to Guinea, Ivory Coast, then to Liberia, Liberia still have 40% of that remaining Upper Guinea forest. And so today, Liberia is among the 35 hard biodiversity spots in the world. So given the importance of our forests, the government of Norway and the government of Liberia enter into this agreement for the government of Norway to provide us with funding so that we'll be able to conserve at least 30% of our remaining forest estate that we talk about. But then most of our population live on the fringes of the forest. So they use the forest as what I term it, normally I tell people, most of those who live on the fringes of the forest use the forest as their supermarket. They go into the forest for food, they go into the forest for medicinal purposes. In terms of religious purposes, some of them even go into the forest for religious purposes. So you see the importance of the forest to the community dwellers. The population that live in the urban cities, like one of the speakers said earlier this morning, when you go around the fringes of the forest, you see poverty. Liberia is no exception. So you go around the forest, people who live on the fringes of the forest, you see poverty. And you see a yearning in people who live around the fringes of the forest for better livelihoods. So part of the agreement, and the way we do agriculture in Liberia is one of those things that are leading to the depletion of the forest. Because what we do in Liberia is traditional farming. And the traditional farming is slash and burn, shifting cultivation. So this year I farm here, the following year I farm somewhere else, the following year. So by the time you look, in 10 years, I'm leaving patches of forest in the middle. One good thing that happened for Liberia when the German Forestry Mission went to Liberia and advised the government of Liberia was the way we do forestry is not clear-felling forestry or logging. So it's rotational logging. Okay, you log by blocks. So that in itself has helped us to have forests up to this time. But the way we do agriculture, and of course, coupled with the way my brother was talking about in terms of charcoal, those are some of the major challenges our forests face today. So part of the agreement we signed with Norway, we took into consideration sustainable agriculture. And mind you, as we are moving today, those who come from West Africa, Central Africa, and South Africa, Southern Africa will tell you that the oil palm sector is now moving towards Africa. Even though, if you look at history, oil palm actually originated from Africa. But it's now going back to Africa. These big concessions are going to Africa. And so part of what our government did after the CIFOR crisis, quote unquote, in order to create jobs, they invited some of those multilateral oil palm companies. And most of the areas that were given to those oil palm companies are the most forested part of our country. So as the Forestry Development Authority, what we have done with the government of Norway, sitting with the government of Norway, discussing, is to begin to create a strategy that those oil palm concessions will not deplete the remaining forests that we have along the West African block, because you talk about 40% of the remaining forests, and the oil palm concessions obviously are going to clear it down, then it's a problem for us. So as a government or as an agency of government, one of the strategies we used initially was to become a member of the Tropical Forest Alliance, TFA 2020. Because most of these large-scale agricultural concessions that have moved to Liberia or Africa are part and parcel or have made some commitments to the Tropical Forest Alliance, the RISPO. So we saw that as an open door, that once we are part of the Tropical Forest Alliance, we can begin to hold some of these concessions by their own commitments they have made to either the RISPO or to TFA 2020. Because TFA 2020 talks about either reducing deforestation in the supply chain or cutting off deforestation in the supply chain. So as a government and as a unit, that's what we did. We became a member of the TFA. But to go further, we are also working with IDA Sustainable Initiative, that is from Holland, and then working along with these agriculture concession companies to see how we can help to protect some of the most valuable forested areas that are in their concession areas. And so what we have done is to work along with communities. Firstly, before working along with community, what we did was to come up with what we call today in Liberia the 9 guiding principles for sustainable palm oil development in Liberia. And part of the 9 guiding principles, one of them talks about zero net deforestation. The other one talks about sustainable livelihood for community dwellers. So when we look at sustainable livelihood for community dwellers, what we have done with the companies and IDH specifically for now is working in Liberia in a region called, in a county called Grand Cru County. So in Grand Cru County, what IDH Sustainable Initiative has started doing with the community is for the community to be able to identify, I don't know the numbers offhand, but a certain number of hectares of land, forested land, high conservation value forested land, to say, okay, we put this in conservation, then IDH, using some of the funding from Norway and hopefully leveraging with the company, will now use degraded land and use that degraded land to help the communities to plant, if the communities decide to plant oil palm, and I'm saying oil palm in this case because oil palm is what the community in Grand Cru have decided to do, to take. So then, in return for conserving that patch of forest by the community, this oil, the community IDH along with the oil palm company will now plant oil palm for the community. So the community folks can, firstly, are going to be hired to work on their own oil palm plantation. And once the oil palm reaches the stage of getting all the crops, the first thing that is being done is part of the money will be going back to IDH to repay IDH because they are taking the risks, and then part of the money is going to go to the communities. But in the interim, while the communities are trying to get to that stage, the stage of maturity of their oil palm, IDH, I don't know the numbers off here again because I'm not working directly on that, but IDH is supposed to be giving the communities certain amount of money, cash, per year until we can reach that stage. So that is just one, and that's a pilot project. Once that works well, then it's going to be rolled over. But what we have also done again is around the mining concession. Around the mining concession, forest degradation is ongoing, deforestation, then forest degradation. So what we have done along that, I thought I had more than that, Paula. I thought my time. What we have done along that is to sign what we call, there's a Conservation International is working with communities around there to help protect the environment and then sign conservation agreements. So part of the conservation agreement is that Conservation International bringing experts to help the communities to do smart agriculture. With my last 1 minute. Challenges. One of the first challenges we are having is the mindset. People are used to doing something the old way. So to change the mindset from doing what people used to do before, because the old way is our comfort zone. So to get out of that comfort zone, to come back into something new, to begin to farm one place for a long time is a serious challenge. Secondly, technology. We are still using the old seeds we used to use those days, and they are not as productive as the new seedlings that are coming out. Technology is another challenge. The third thing is capacity itself. In order to be able to build the capacity of those community dwellers who live on the fringes of the forest. I stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Sa. I hope I didn't cut you much, but you will have a chance to talk more later. I think the example of Liberia, it's again fantastic. Of course, it's historic. It's 10, 15 years they're working towards that, but this partnership with the private sector, with palm oil companies, and really looking at the landscape approach as a way to increase the income of the communities, I think it's very, very special, and it has some similarity to what we just heard from Bolivia as well on what they are trying to do, and it comes also with a strong emphasis on land rights of the communities, which is also another important topic. But now let me move to Italy. So we can do landscape approach not only in Latin America, not only in Africa, but let's go down to one of the region of Italy, Tuscany, that is one of the regions that has developed maybe the most developed integrated landscape plan. And we would like to hear from Mauro Agnoletti, who's a professor at the University of Florence, but also the coordinator of the Landscape Observatory of the Regione Toscana, a little bit about this, what is this integrated landscape plan of the Tuscany region, how did it came about, what are its elements, and also how is Tuscany able to increase the value of the assets that they have, all the certification of the products and all these labels and all these things that make the products that come from this territory, products that are sold in the markets with a higher value. Thank you very much, Mauro.
Thank you, Paula. So, first of all, I thank the organization for inviting me here, and sorry also for my voice. The weather here in Bonn has not improved my cold, so you have to excuse me. So first of all, where the landscape plan of Tuscany come from, before explaining what it is. And the first landscape law in Italy was made in 1939. Also a law that was protecting certain landscape across the country. But after the signature of the European Landscape Convention, we had a national law which is requiring to all the 20 regional governments to develop a landscape plan. And also, this idea of incorporating landscape into development went also to other policies. I take here the example of the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Forestry. Landscape was introduced as an objective of the National Strategic Plan for Rural Development in 2017. And this has created a number of activity concerning this topic that now will be too long to explain. But so the landscape plan of Tuscany comes from these two things. And the landscape plan is a legally binding tool which has created a vision which is trying to harmonize economic, environmental, and social processes. A legally binding tool means that after the description of the value represented by the Tuscan landscape, there is a discipline of use, so-called, which regulate all the economic activity, urban development, infrastructure, industry, farming activity, and forest activity. So each one of them is under a strict regulation, which means that you can do things according to the fact that you have to protect the value that has been recognized by the landscape plan. So in this respect, we've been held by, as I said, the national legislation. In Italy, forests are all under landscape protection. And we also have 20% of the territory which is protected for nature conservation. Tuscany has the same rate of protection. And so the idea of having a landscape plan in place was to move from a territorial plan, a development plan that we had before, choosing landscape as a better perspective for our sustainable development. And in this respect, you have to understand that Tuscany as a region with only 4% of the urban area, all the rest is rural areas. We have 55% of forest and more than 40% is farmed land. And in this rural territory, maybe many of you knows about the important cities like Florence or Siena and so on, but actually the rural landscape of Tuscany is being considered not only beautiful, but also a resource for our economy. Tuscany is the first region of Italy as a number of typical food protected. It's also the first region of Italy for rural tourism. This is creating an interesting combination for the fact that in many cases, most of the income of the farms come from renting their home to tourists. So the people who come in the territory know their products, discover foods that cannot be on the global market. So there's no way that we can produce 1,000 or millions of bottles of wine or olive oil or any other product. We want our product to be produced there. So you come to the region, you know the territory, you meet the farmers, and you enjoy the two things, the landscape and the food production. And also in this respect, I have to say that we are the first region of Italy for certified food, but we wanted to go beyond this. What do I mean? Is that if you look at the history of the denomination of origin, so a label saying that the one product is produced in one area, you see that when you started at the beginning, the people did not know whether it was working or not, but after 20 years, what we found out that if one food is being successful, all the farmers wanted to produce that food. And this started to change the landscape. So since the diversity of the landscape and the variety of the landscape is a resource, so this is a richness also in terms of biodiversity. We always focus on biodiversity in terms of species and animal, but actually also the landscape mosaic is a feature of the biodiversity, and many animal and vegetal species grows on cultivated land, on cultivated forest. So in this respect, we thought that the certification label, which is certifying the landscape structure, means we are praising those farmers that are producing the local food, but not degrading the structure of the landscape. It's going to save us from the fact that we might degrade our traditional landscape according to even the success of some typical food that can become important. In this respect, the idea of combining the quality of the food with the quality of the landscape, so the landscape has become an added value for the food, not only means that you are producing a food in a nice place. No, it means that the way you are producing is part of the quality of the landscape. I will go now in some details, but maybe some of you knows, for instance, let's take an easy example. Dry stone terraces that are distributed all over the world, I would say in the mountain areas. Tuscany is for 90% of the territory mountain and hills. So if we're producing the same thing, the same food on a stone terraces or instead on a plain, the quality of the food is different, because the stone of the terraces are incorporating the heat of the sun during the hot hours of the day and releasing the heat during the night. So this is helping the ripening of the food, and so it has an effect on the quality of the food. These are the farmers who discover this different quality. Science is behind, I would say, in understanding this. That's why also in Italy we have developed the National Register of Historic Rural Landscape and Traditional Agricultural Practices, because we found out that not always industrialization and innovation are successful. Sometimes they are not successful. They create degradation, abandonment. Many farmers go simply out of business because of this globalization of the market and depend on financial market more or less. So that is a way of preserving this tradition that in terms of sustainability are very important, because normally we have landscape with low energy input, low external energy input. So you may produce less by hectare, but you produce in a more sustainable way and the quality is better. Of course, this is a nice story, but in the application of the plan, we also have several conflicts. Most of all, say the first and most important conflict was between agriculture and landscape protection. It's very interesting, because big agricultural entrepreneurs wanted to have the freedom to exploit the Tuscany landscape. Producing Tuscany today has become like a brand for many big firms who like to come in our region, buy the land, buy the farmers, produce their food there, and then they sell both the territory and the food. So they wanted to have freedom to industrialize the land, create, I'm from the land where we have lots of wine, industrial monoculture of wine, I would say. So an open-air factory is producing wine. This is happening for many products. We didn't like this, so we tried to put rules not only on the amount, but on the way you are shaping the landscape. So what is the size of a field? Well, historically, we have small field due to sharecrop system, so we want to maintain this small production scale. This has created a huge conflict that made the landscape plan go through a legal process, so at several layers. At the end, of course, we had to come to a political agreement. The same problem we had with mining activity. Probably you know the marble quarry on some part of Tuscany, the one used for many monuments across the world, where Michelangelo created his famous piece of art. Well, those mountains had been almost destroyed because of this activity. So here again, there was a conflict. And the conflict, just in one word, is between an idea of innovation that seems to go against the idea of conservation. Actually, there's no conflicts between the two. There's no innovation without the re-elaboration of elements that are already in the history of a place or in the history of a country, as there is no conservation without the creation of new value. So at the end, this is a false problem, because the idea of development that we try, on which we try to focus, is that we don't have to go for high quantity, let's say, in agriculture production. We go for quality. The same thing for the quality of life. Landscape and the quality of the rural landscape is being introduced by the National Statistical Agency, the ISTAT, in the indicator of the well-being of the population. So the conservation of certain types of landscape is part of the way you are judging the quality of life, which is a way to go beyond the GDP and bring something new and better for the life of the population. Of course, this was a participatory project, and I'm finished my time. And all the plan was discussed in every province of Tuscany with public meetings, where they had huge of discussion and debates, because of course the idea that people like me may have from an intellectual point of view the landscape, it doesn't mean that the same perception that people have. And with this I finish, we must realize that we are looking at the landscape from the point of view, in most of cases, I don't want to offend anybody, from an urban society. When you go in the rural territory, the farmers have a very different view of what is the landscape, what is important for them. So this is something to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mauro. I think a round of applause to everybody. I just want to say that we have seen some incredible examples from all the regions, 2 regions of the world, plus Europe as well, and see how there are similarities among all the regions about the issues that they are facing, the need for a landscape approach, the fact that let's say with this last intervention, in Italy it's even becoming a law, basically. It has a legal value, this plan, so it's something that you have to really obey to. Is not an option, it's not a plan for the shelves, and I think that's an important element. But some of these problems of land grabbing from Tuscany to Liberia, of a big industry, and how you can reconcile increasing the productivity with the local value, the cultural value of the landscape. I think that are all issues that everybody has been touching on. But let me now try to move to the most fun, the part that is most fun of this discussion forum, which is really getting from you some questions for the speakers. And let me try to collect 2 or 3 at the time. If you can, just briefly introduce yourself, and if you can, just tell us to which speaker you are giving the question to. So we have one question here, and let me start with you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Garland, and I'm doing my master in the Technical University of Munich, but I come from Peru. So my question is directed to the case of Bolivia. You mentioned that you have this integral management plan, but I wanted to know if it includes management of non-timber products, and if you also consider maybe ecotourism or sustainable tourism with the communities involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me collect 2 or 3. We have one more here.
Thank you. My name is Mashauri. I come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And my question goes to my colleague from the African continent, and maybe to pick up from what you said about land grabbing. And it's a serious trend in Africa, and I was just surprised that also in Italy they're also facing the same problem. But I tend to believe that it's more pronounced in African context, and it's a serious threat to landscape restoration, to food security, mostly for smallholder farmers, and also to indigenous people who depend mostly on forest. And this is something that really escaped in the case studies, and I wanted to understand how are we copying the lesson from Liberia, the lesson from Malawi, and maybe from the government point of view, at what extent do they think that they'll come out of such long-term binding agreement they are signing with multilateral companies?
Thank you. One more question.
Thank you very much. My name is Frank van Schouwbroek from Farm Tree Services. If I hear the 5 speakers, I count well, yeah. I hear some with an intention to have a landscape approach with all the stakeholders involved, and other that have actually achieved it. Yeah, I don't have to point out who is who. And I think a crucial thing in this is, what I also understand from the question for help from Bolivia, is that all the stakeholders have an economic or an interest, probably an economic interest in that part of landscape. So I'm very interested to hear, first of all, if that is true, if I have understood that well, and the second, how that has worked in the Italy and Liberia landscapes, and how that could be a lesson for the others who are planning to have that kind of landscape. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with these 3. In the meantime, think about some more questions. So who wants to start? Maybe we should start with Bolivia.
Thank you very much for your question from our colleague from Peru. In fact, you're right, my exposition was very short, but anyway, those plans for management of land and forests also include many other activities. We have a lot of tableaus, for example, we have a lot of valleys, and we had a tropical region. And of course, in the tropical region, we have other different resources, different from timber, from lumber. We have also the exploitation of lumber, timber in different products, but we can do any other activities, like, for example, ecotourism, communitary tourism. I think this is a way of producing in those regions. In fact, there are many economic activities we have developed in Bolivia. For example, there is ecotourism with indigenous communities, and that's a real part of the management plan we have in Bolivia. And I would also like to say that we have been able to restore some pieces of landscape that were completely degraded. We have achieved that through agroforestry, for example, from plantation of forests. So we have a real integral plan, and we have a holistic approach of the whole landscape. We try to find the best possible way for the community to manage that landscape, and it has to be sustainable, in a sustainable way.
Mauro, to comment also on this ecotourism. You mentioned that in Tuscany, the tourism is an important revenues for the farmers inside the landscape. Can you comment a little bit more about how important that is and
well, this is
as an economic incentive?
Was a phenomenon that came out, I would say, on itself. It was not planned by the regional government. Just to tell you the importance of this, during the last 4 or 5 years of the huge economic crisis that Tuscany, as Italy and several parts of Europe has gone through, we have lost 22,000 jobs in industry, 12,000 jobs in services, but we have seen 5,000 more jobs in tourism and the growth of 400% of rural tourism. So this is something that has created, of course, a number of problems in terms of regulation, which means, for instance, deciding who can really do that. In the sense, as I told you, many people like me can buy a farmhouse. I'm not a farmer, but I'm renting the farmhouse. So I will keep my land just for maintaining it's beautiful, maybe, or just have some small product to sell. Instead, there are farmers who are real farmers who live out of the things they're producing that would require a support from our agricultural policy, which means subsidies that we go through the common agricultural policy. So at some point, the phenomenon has become so huge that we have to introduce a strict regulation. So today you can be authorized to be an agritourism according to the fact that you're producing, your income is half coming from food production and half coming from tourism. Otherwise, you don't get any subsidies for this activity. You can be a private person. So in this respect, this is still a new thing. It continues to grow. And of course, as a country coming from the developed part of the world, we have seen the decrease of the value of agriculture and the GDP, let's say from after the war, from 50-60% now in Tuscany to 2%. But of course, what is happening now is that the rural economy, which is no longer based on production of food, it has become more complex. So this has been integrated with a different economic model. So the multifunctionality, I would say, of our agricultural model is one of the most interesting things that has occurred in this last few years.
Thank you very much, Mauro. I think that, the economic incentive comes also from this multifunctionality of agricultural land. Why don't we ask to Sa, Liberia, to comment a little bit on this question about land grabbing?
What we have done so far as a country or government is, firstly, in 2009, it was passed into law, signed by the president, that all of the forest areas have been turned back to the communities, those who live around the fringes of the forest. So no longer can the FDA or the government of Liberia give forestry concession without the community being the key drivers of that forestry concessions. What happened prior to 2009 was the government, people sit in the community and all of a sudden they see in the morning hours bulldozers coming into the community and saying, the government have given us a concession here. But when they gave the oil palm concessions, giving the fallback that came from communities, because the FPIG was not fully implemented, so the government realized that, you know what, it's time for us to give back the communities their land. What is before the upper house now is a national law that is going to be passed that has 4 categories of land. And those 4 categories of land, in most instances, it's like the land is now being returned to the people. Prior to the law going before the House, we're all under the assumption that government owned all of the land. And so those of us who were on those lands were only squatters if you did not buy the land to have a land deal. So we're only squatters. But for now, as it is, with the 2009 passage of the community rights law, it's like technically we have recognized customary land for the community dwellers. So the issue of land grabbing, yes, that has been an issue, but we think with the new law and the 2009 land rights, it's going to kick it away for us in Liberia.
Thank you, sir. Let me also ask to Clement if you want to comment both on the land grabbing, I don't know if that's happening in Malawi, and on maybe the economic incentives that are behind the restoration strategy of Malawi. What do you think will ensure that people will restore their land?
Yeah, in fact, that's an issue, incentives to the people, but also government. We realized in Malawi that government puts priority in agriculture, education, and they forget forest. What we've done now is to impress on everyone that you cannot do agriculture properly without the forest. So the incentive really from conserving the landscape is issues like water. You get better water availability. You reduce soil erosion. So people already see that by doing landscape restoration, you will get better yields in terms of crop because of better, all those things. You're more resilient to climate change. Those are incentives. In terms of land grabbing, it's not a major issue in Malawi. Because we do separate between customary land, the law does, and other pieces of land which can be offered for concessioning. You cannot get a concession from customary land without the approval of the traditional system, the leadership. But even in forest reserves that are managed by government, concessioning, there are rules there that ensure that it is not grabbing, but you get a concession agreed by all parties in terms of how long and what happens after expiry of the concession. So as far as I know, there is no problem at all with the grabbing of land in Malawi.
Excellent. Let me ask also one question to Marcelo before the last round. Marcelo, in terms of these non-timber products and ecotourism, you are really working with the communities. What is that you see in Bolivia when you work with them in terms of the products that they are really sort of trying to conserve, trying to produce, trying to get an income out of? Are we talking about non-timber forest products? Are we talking about ecotourism? Are they selling them on the markets? What are these plans about concretely?
Can you hear me? Well, the communities in the forest, they have a more holistic vision. For example, in the Chiquitana region, the communities have come to realize that they cannot have a bank account, but they have cattle, for example. And in case of emergency, they are able to sell a cow, for example. And that's a way of saving money. In Minga, we support agroforestry systems for the communities. In that way, people are able to restore landscapes, to preserve landscape. People are able to plant today and then they will receive the harvest in 3 or 4 years. So we have many products. For example, it's called Mendra. For example, in Brazil, this plant is called Aru. And this product has a big potential in the market. Minga has supported the planting of the production of mango. It's a non-timber product with a lot of potential in the market. We have also supported the fact that wild fruits can be used. For example, there are many fruits that are not planted. They can be gathered in the forest, and there could be a big economic potential for that kind of activities, fruits. Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you very much.
Questions. We can take 3 more questions. Okay, one here.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Schulz, University of Potsdam. Thank you all for your impressions on all the different experiences you have. Talking about the term landscape restoration, I think it's quite problematic because what is a landscape restoration? Landscapes are all kinds of ecosystems coming together, and what I'm really wondering, we have mostly the topic of the session was looking at food production and restoration at the same time. Often these things go against each other, and there's trade-offs, and there's questions of spatial prioritization, spatial planning. The only example I have heard where this has really been tackled is Italy, where you obviously have a long tradition on spatial planning. How are these questions of spatial optimization, looking of where do we do what, are being tackled? How are they being addressed, and who's coordinating the process and making sure the communities have their share on these processes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see a question there. You?
Hi, Giuseppe Fantozzi, the World Bank. My question is has something in common with my predecessor, but it's more directed to our guests from Malawi and Liberia. And because the point is that I would like more to focus on the food security aspect than resilience and livelihoods. Also from the introduction of the Assistant Director General, we all know that food security is number 2 of the SDGs as a big space, while sustainable forest practices is only somewhere, if I'm not wrong, in the number 15, together with many other things. So overall, in general terms, food security should be the main attention of countries that have some food security indicators that should be improved, like Liberia and Malawi. And a forest should somehow be not ancillary, but anyway, something that is a tool towards also helping, supporting achievement of food security indicators. So my question is, in your experience, both coming from the government or from donors or whatever, what is the discussion going on how forestry, besides conservation, restoration, whatever, can really help trying your countries to achieve the SDG number 2 on food security indicators? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more. If there are no more questions, let me try to go to the panelists. You need to be very short because we will also have someone doing a short summary. So we have these 2 questions. Let me start with, who wants to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay, why don't you start with restoration, Mauro?
Yes, despite the fact that we have this tradition, the restoration issues has become more important in the last few years. Just to offer you a small provocation, since you heard that we have all this protection for the forest in place, 100%, Italy is facing now an abandonment of the farmed land. So for us, restoration has become a process trying to find a way to remove the forest that has grown over abandoned land and allow the farmers to start again agricultural activities. So first of all, the problem was to change our protection system, because our protection system was based on the fact that forest is good always. But as a matter of fact, for some farmers' food production, it is the other way around. So this was first the problem of allowing a change in the view we were looking at the landscape protection. The other thing, very short, is about when you use the word restoration, as you were saying. Here I would have to go to a semantic analysis, but to make the long story short, in the Italian language, restauro, restoration, does not apply to what we are discussing. We use another word, ripristino, which means that you are giving back to the land some function according to certain rules. So restoration is not the correct word. And the other thing is that many people think that, let's say, I remove some forest and I start agriculture, or I plant a forest in an area and we do a restoration project or a landscape project. It's not a landscape project. This is an afforestation or a restoration of abandoned land. A landscape project is something different. It must have a vision and has a wider scope.
Okay, I think we have Liberia first and then
I think in terms of the restoration question, I think you have said it more than particularly I would have said it. But I think we are actually looking at restoration in Liberia in the context of forest and the people who live around that particular piece of land. So that's the context in which we are looking at restoration. I don't know if I can say more than he has said. But in terms of the food security you speak of, we are actually looking at it in Liberia also, again, in the context of livelihood. Our concentration from the Forestry Development Authority is on forest. But in order to conserve or preserve the forest around there, there must be some alternative sources of livelihood given to people who live around the fringes of the forest, because their livelihood is that forest. So we are actually looking at it. And once you provide some source of livelihood, like I was giving an example of IDH, if the community desires to conserve, say, 60 hectares, and IDH will say, okay, this is a degraded land. We want to plant X, Y, Z, depending on what the community decides to do. Then that is what we gave the community as the alternative source of livelihood, because the community definitely is going to get her livelihood from what that community have decided to use the degraded land for. So in terms of food security, that's the reason why I said initially we have developed what we term in Liberia, but it's actually meant for the nine guiding principles for sustainable oil palm development. Because the fear we have is, if you give the oil palm concessions chance, they're going to take all of the land. Then people who live around there, what would they depend on in terms of livelihood, in terms of food? So then once we develop these 9 guiding principles, part of that 9 guiding principles, part of it is also food security. So that concession that is operating in that environment will have to take into consideration the food security of that community. So before you can even begin to plant, you must discuss with the community what the community needs in terms of livelihood or in terms of food.
Okay. Let me get to Bolivia. Yes, I would like to add something with respect to restoration. And Bolivia is in a lucky situation to have only a small population, but a lot of resources, natural resources, and that's why we think we are better able to plan the use of spaces or regions or land in an ordinated manner. To achieve a productive development for the communities, so that the communities can get out of the poverty. And at present, they receive land with and without forest, but they have to work on that in a very structured manner. And in some parts, they have to restore in the high plains and in the valleys. And there are activities of restoration, and we are introducing a better management of forests. Another important aspect is that the question has been asked, how to integrate the different actors, the institutional actors, both on the national, international
subnational level and municipal level, and that is not easy. That's really a challenge that we have been working on for 20 years in Bolivia, and we are still working on that, trying to find the right phrasing, to find the policies so that the communities can get forward.
I would like to invite Terry Sunderland of CIFOR to give us a very short summary of our session.
Thank you. And first, let me say, one of the things that has struck me about previous global landscapes forums is we've had very few examples of landscape approaches in the field. So it's been very gratifying to hear real examples from the field. So congratulations to the organizers for putting together such a good panel. I'm going to speak quickly because I know that time is short and we have to go to the next session. But it strikes me there are lots of parallels happening in the landscapes that have been presented here. But there's also an issue of context. I'm actually familiar with Malawi and Liberia from a forestry perspective. I've never been to Bolivia, and I've been to Tuscany a few times, though I haven't actually bought a farmhouse there yet. But it's interesting. Obviously, there are contextual differences that come out along with those parallels. And one of the constraints to the landscape approach that came out this morning was the broad brush approach to taking sort of macro level approaches to managing landscapes that sort of override the contextual issues, which is why in many respects from the conceptual ideals of the landscape approach that have been propagated by the Global Landscapes Forum, everything's kept vague. You heard Robert Nazi said, we're not talking about definitions, we're not talking about specifics. But there are all kinds of landscapes for all kinds of people, and it's very important to recognize that. There's no prescription, if you like. In terms of some commonalities, issues of conflicts always seem to arise at the landscape scale. And one of the major ways of overcoming these is through mediation and getting a sense of consensus and compromise, if you like. There's always going to be competing demands on resources and competing demands within and without the landscapes themselves, and that can only be essentially mitigated by bringing people together and getting the same people in the room. We had experience of that in Cameroon, and that was a relatively successful process, but it was very difficult to get people who are logging concessionaires, oil palm concessionaires, conservation organizations and the government to sit down and actually even start a dialogue about what their respective visions for the landscape. But I hear that there's obviously those kind of partnerships and dialogues already happening in these particular landscapes. In terms of food security and nutrition, this is something that we've done a lot of work on recently, and particularly in the context of proximity to forests. And in Liberia and Malawi, there's actually data, along with other 23 other African countries, that shows that people in closer proximity to forests are actually better nourished, which is completely independent on poverty levels. And this is quite interesting. So don't discard poverty or conflate poverty with nutritional problems, because there's far less stunting in the rural areas of Liberia, Malawi, and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa than there are elsewhere, particularly in urban areas. And I think my last point, two last points rather, public-private partnerships are also very important. We've heard about the role of the private sector in some of these landscapes. Getting the public-private partnerships in place, again, is a bit like getting logging concessionaires and conservation organizations in the same room. These have to happen, though. These dialogues do have to happen, but they have to be based on respect for rights and equity, and making sure that oil palm concessionaires in places like Liberia are operating to the finest ethical principles, and making sure that that's actually followed up and monitored. And the last thing I wanted to say was about the importance of resilience. The multifunctional landscape approach lends itself to much more resilient processes, not only in terms of environmental impacts, but also economic impacts. And this has a huge impact correspondingly on the people who live and work in those landscapes, particularly smallholder farmers, as I mentioned this morning in a brief talk.
All right, so thank you very much for the summary, and a big applause for our panelists. Thank you. Yeah, very good.
You did a good job.
Thank you. Can everybody put their headsets in the box? Thank you.
The plenary is starting in about 2 minutes. So please, if everyone, No, 5:45. If everyone can go straight to the plenary for Eric Solheim and Saguru conversation now. In the plenary, starting now. Thank you. And don't forget to leave your headsets.